Chapter 8 The Queen's Croquet Ground. A big rose bush was near the entrance of the garden. The roses on it were white, but 3 gardeners were painting them red. Alice found this strange and went closer to see. Just as she got there, she heard one of the gardeners say, "Watch out, 5. Don't get paint on me." 5 spoke with a sulky voice and said, "I couldn't stop it, 7 bumped into my arm." 7 looked up and said, "Yes, that's right 5. It's always best to blame others." "Don't talk," 5 warned. "The Queen said you should be punished yesterday." "What for?" said the one who had spoken first. "That's none of your business, 2, said 7. 5 said, "Yes, it's his job. I will tell him it was for getting the cooked tulip roots instead of onions." 7 put down his brush and was about to say, "Wow, that's not fair." But then he saw Alice watching them and stopped talking. The others also looked at her, and all of them bowed their heads as a sign of respect. "Can you tell me why you're painting those roses?" asked Alice shyly. 5 and 7 didn't say anything but looked at 2. 2 started to speak quietly. "The thing is, we made a mistake by putting a white rose tree instead of a red one. If the Queen finds out, we will all lose our heads. So we are trying to fix it before she comes." Suddenly, 5, who was watching the garden, shouted, "The Queen! The Queen!" All 3 gardeners quickly lay flat on their faces. There was a lot of noise, and Alice turned to see the Queen. First, 10 soldiers carrying clubs came. They looked like the 3 gardeners, and were long and flat. Their hands and feet were at the corners. Next, 10 fancy courtiers came. They were covered in diamonds and walked 2 by 2 like the soldiers. Then, the royal children came. There were 10 of them and they were jumping happily hand in hand. They were decorated with hearts. After that, the guests arrived, mostly kings and queens. Alice saw the white rabbit among them. It was talking quickly and nervously, smiling at everything, and went by without noticing her. Then, the Knave of Hearts came, carrying the king's crown on a red cushion. Finally, the King and Queen of Hearts came last in the big procession. Alice wasn't sure if she should lie down like the 3 gardeners, but she couldn't recall ever hearing about this rule at a procession. She thought, why have a procession if everyone has to lie down and can't see it? So she stayed where she was and waited. The group stopped and looked at Alice when they reached her. The Queen asked in a strict tone, "Who is this person?" The Knave of Hearts only nodded and smiled, but didn't answer. The Queen said, "What's your name, child?" while tossing her head impatiently. Alice said, "My name is Alice." "Please, Your Majesty." She spoke politely. But she thought to herself, "They're just a deck of cards. I don't need to be scared." "Who are these?" asked the Queen, pointing at 3 gardeners lying near a rose tree. She couldn't tell if they were gardeners, soldiers, courtiers, or even her own children because they were lying down with the same pattern on their backs as the others. "I don't know," Alice said, amazed she was brave enough to say it. "It's not my concern." The Queen became very angry and looked at the person with a fierce expression. Then, she started yelling, "Cut off her head! Cut off! That's silly!" Alice yelled loudly and strongly. The Queen was quiet. The King gently touched her arm and said in a soft voice, "Think about it, my dear. She is just a kid." The Queen was angry and told the Knave to turn them over. The Knave did so, very carefully, with one foot. "Stand up," the Queen said loudly and sharply. The 3 gardeners quickly stood up and bowed to the King, Queen, royal children, and others. "Stop that," yelled the Queen. "You make me dizzy." Then she turned to the rose tree and asked, "What have you been doing here?" "Your Majesty, please," said 2, speaking politely and respectfully while kneeling on one knee. "We were attempting to." The Queen looked at the roses and said, "I understand." Then she ordered, "Cut off their heads," and the group continued on. 3 soldiers stayed to kill the gardeners who ran to Alice for help. Alice said, "You won't get your head cut off." She put them in a big flower pot nearby. The 3 soldiers searched for them for a bit, then walked away quietly after the others. "Are their heads off?" shouted the Queen. The soldiers said, "Their heads are gone, Your Majesty." "Yes, Queen. Can you play croquet?" The soldiers were quiet and stared at Alice because the question was for her. "Yes," shouted Alice. "Let's go," shouted the Queen, and Alice followed, curious about what would happen next. A soft voice said, "It's a lovely day." The White Rabbit was peeking at her worriedly. "Very," said Alice. "Where's the Duchess?" "Be quiet," said the rabbit quickly and softly. He looked worried and checked behind him. Then he stood on his toes and whispered in her ear, "She's going to be put to death." "What for?" said Alice. "Did you say 'what a pity'?" the rabbit asked. "No, I didn't," Alice said. "I don't feel bad about it." I asked, "Why?" She hit the Queen's ears, the rabbit started. Alice made a small noise of laughter. "Shh," the rabbit whispered quietly, scared. "The Queen might hear you. You know she came late and she said dash." The Queen shouted, "Go to your spots." People started running around bumping into each other, but they quickly got organized and the game started. Alice thought the croquet ground she saw was very strange. It had bumps and valleys. The croquet balls were hedgehogs and the mallets were flamingos. The soldiers had to bend over and stand on their hands and feet to form the arches. The main problem Alice had was controlling her flamingo. She managed to hold its body under her arm with its legs hanging down. But every time she tried to straighten its neck to hit the hedgehog, it would twist and look at her in a confused way that made her laugh. And when she finally got its head down, she found that the hedgehog had unrolled and was crawling away. The ground also had ridges and furrows that made it hard to send the hedgehog where she wanted. With soldiers walking off, she soon realized that the game was very difficult. All the players played together without taking turns and argued over the hedgehogs. The Queen quickly got very angry and started shouting, "Off with her head," every minute. Alice felt worried. She hadn't argued with the Queen yet, but she knew it could happen soon. She thought, "What will happen to me if it does? They like to chop off people's heads here. It's amazing that anyone is still alive." She searched for a way to escape and wondered if she could leave without being seen. Then, she saw something strange in the air and was confused. After looking for a short time, she realized it was a smile. She said to herself, "It's the Cheshire Cat. Now I have someone to talk to." "How are you doing?" asked the cat when it had enough room to talk. Alice waited until she saw the eyes, then she nodded. She thought it's no use talking to it until its ears or at least one of them appeared. Soon after, the whole head showed up and Alice put down her flamingo and started telling about the game. She was happy to have someone to listen to her. The cat seemed satisfied with what it saw, and no more appeared. "I don't think they play fair." Alice spoke in a complaining voice. "They argue so much you can't hear yourself talk. There don't seem to be any rules and no one follows them. It's very confusing because everything is alive. For example, there's an arch I have to go through and I almost hit the Queen's hedgehog with my croquet ball, but it ran away." "Do you like the Queen?" asked the cat softly. "No way," Alice said. "She's so good, it's not worth playing the game." The Queen was close and heard her speak. The Queen smiled and passed on. "Who you talking to?" said King, approaching Alice and looking at the cat's head with interest. Alice said, "This is a friend of mine, a Cheshire Cat. Let me introduce it." King said, "I don't like its appearance. But it can kiss my hand if it wants to." "I'd rather not," the cat remarked. "Be respectful," the King said, "and don't give me that look." He moved behind Alice while speaking. Alice said, "A cat is allowed to look at a king." She added, "I read that in a book, but I forgot where." The King said firmly, "It needs to be taken away." He called the Queen who was walking by and said, "Dear, please take this cat away." The Queen had a single way to solve any problem, big or small. She said, "Cut off his head," without even turning her head. King said he will bring executioner himself and went quickly. Alice felt she should return to see how the game was progressing. She heard the Queen shouting loudly. Alice had already heard the Queen sentence 3 players to death for not taking their turns. She did not like what was happening because the game was so chaotic she couldn't tell if it was her turn. So, she went to look for her hedgehog. A hedgehog and another hedgehog were fighting. Alice thought it was a good chance to play croquet with one of them using the other. The only problem was that her flamingo went to the other side of the garden and was trying, but failing, to fly into a tree. Alice caught the flamingo and brought it back. The fight was done and the hedgehogs were gone. Alice thought it didn't matter as there were no arches left. She held the flamingo tightly so it wouldn't escape again and went to talk to her friend. She returned to the Cheshire Cat and was shocked to see a big group of people gathered around it. There was an argument happening between the executioner, King, and Queen. They were all talking together, but everyone else was quiet and looked uncomfortable. When Alice appeared, everyone wanted her to solve the problem. They told her their reasons, but they all talked at the same time, so it was difficult for Alice to understand what they were saying. The person who carries out execution said that to cut off a head, there must be a body. They had never done it before and they did not plan to start now. The King said that if something has a head, it can be chopped off and not to talk nonsense. The Queen said that if nothing was done quickly, she would order everyone to be killed. This made everyone at the party look worried. Alice had no other words to say, she just said, "It's the Duchess' property, it's better to ask her about it." The Queen told the executioner, "She's in jail. Bring her here." The executioner left quickly. The cat's head started to fade as soon as it left, and by the time it returned with the Duchess, it was completely gone. The King and executioner searched for it while the others went back to playing the game.